The Strange Medicine, A History of Ketamine. The year is 1962, and in a Detroit laboratory, a chemist named Calvin Stevens is searching for something the world desperately needs. An anesthetic that won't kill you.
I think this will work.
The reigning surgical anesthetic of the era was phencyclidine, better known as PCP. It worked. It numbed. It sent patients into a deep, controllable void. But it had a dark side that no surgeon could live with. It made people psychotic. Patients waking from PCP anesthesia clawed at the air, screamed at invisible tormentors, and sometimes never quite came back to themselves. The medical world needed something cleaner, something safer, something that stood at the edge of PCP's power without tumbling into its madness. Stevens synthesized CI 581, a cousin to PCP but shorter lived, gentler in its grip. His colleagues at Park Davis Pharmaceutical Company looked at the molecular structure and felt cautious optimism. It was time to find out what it did to a human mind. The prisoners of Michigan. They couldn't exactly ask for volunteers off the street. So in 1964, researchers turned to a population that had long been used, controversially, ethically questionably, as a testing ground for new drugs. Prisoners at a Michigan correctional facility. The men who raised their hands for the first human ketamine trials didn't know what to expect. What they got was something no word in the English language had yet been invented to describe. The drug hit fast. Within minutes, the volunteers reported that their bodies had ceased to exist. Not pain, absence, not sleep, something weirder. They floated. They drifted into a dark, warm space where the prison walls, the fluorescent lights, the researchers in white coats, all of it, simply stopped being real. Some of them said they felt dead, not dying, dead, present, aware, but completely untethered from the physical world. Researcher Ed Domino watched his subjects carefully, took meticulous notes, and struggled to characterize what he was witnessing. These men weren't unconscious, they were elsewhere. He went home that evening and told his wife what he'd seen. Patients awake but absent, disconnected from their own flesh and the room around them. She listened, then offered a word: dissociative. A dissociative anesthetic. The term entered medical literature, and the drug got a new name: ketamine. The molecule itself, to understand what those prisoners experienced. What every person who has ever taken ketamine has experienced. You have to go inside the brain. The human brain is an electrochemical storm, billions of neurons firing messages at each other through a dizzying array of chemical messengers. One of the most important of these is glutamate, the brain's primary excitatory neurotransmitter, the chemical that says, fire, connect, process, feel. Glutamate works largely through a receptor called NMDA, the N-methyl D-aspartate receptor, a kind of gate built into the surface of neurons. When glutamate binds to the NMDA receptor, the gate opens, calcium rushes in, and the neuron lights up. Ketamine is an NMDA receptor antagonist. It doesn't activate the gate, it blocks it. It slips inside the ion channel and sits there like a cork in a bottle, preventing the normal flow of chemical communication. The result is a disruption so profound that the brain's ability to integrate sensory information essentially breaks down. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of your sense of self, your ability to place yourself in time and space, goes quiet. The default mode network, the neural system responsible for your continuous internal narrative, your sense of I am here, I am me, loses its coherence. The brain, suddenly unable to construct its usual reality, does what brains do. It improvises. It fills the silence with something else. That something else is the K-hole, the out-of-body drift, the feeling of being poured out of yourself like water from a glass. At lower doses, ketamine produces a gentle dissociation. Colors shift, sound warps, the body feels remote and pleasurable. At higher doses, it can produce what some researchers call a near-death experience, a complete dissolution of ego, a sensation of floating in infinite space, a confrontation with something that feels, with absolute sincerity, like the void or the divine. But here's the twist. That same NMDA blockade does something else entirely. Something nobody expected. It triggers a cascade of glutamate activity in other brain regions, flooding synapses with AMPA receptor stimulation, sparking the release of BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, essentially a fertilizer for neurons. Synaptic connections that have withered under the long drought of depression suddenly have the conditions to regrow. It is, in the most literal neurological sense, a reset. And then there's the fungus. Decades after ketamine synthesis, scientists made an unsettling discovery.
This fungus excretes ketamine molecules.
Pashonia chlamydospora, a common fungus living quietly in soil across the world, produces ketamine naturally. It had been doing so long before any chemist ever assembled the molecule in a lab. Why? No one fully knows. Perhaps as a chemical weapon against competing organisms, perhaps as a signaling tool. But the implication hangs in the air. This molecule is not purely human invention. It is, in some sense, ancient. The Earth was already making it. The buddy drug forward to the jungles of Vietnam. A medic's worst nightmare isn't necessarily the enemy. It's the window between injury and treatment, that stretch of time on the ground where a soldier is bleeding, screaming, going into shock, and the drugs available to help might stop his heart before the bullet does.
It hurts so bad. This is the buddy drug. It'll help. Do.
Morphine, the standard battlefield analgesic, was genuinely dangerous at the doses needed for severe trauma. It suppressed respiration. It could kill a man whose body was already fighting for its life. Ketamine changed that calculus. Unlike opioids, it doesn't suppress breathing. It maintains airway reflexes. It provides profound analgesia without the lethality. Soldiers began carrying it on their person. Small injectable doses tucked into kit, so that if a buddy went down, you didn't have to wait for a medic. You pulled out your vial and you saved his life. The buddy drug. It was crude, battlefield pragmatic, far from clinical. But it worked, and it planted ketamine permanently in the military medical infrastructure, a reputation it carries to this day. John Lilly and the Dolphins. Not everyone who found ketamine in those years was interested in surgery. John C. Lilly was a neuroscientist, a polymath, and by the 1970s, a man who had long since departed the conventional lane of research. He had pioneered sensory deprivation tanks. He had mapped the pleasure centers of the brain with implanted electrodes. He was obsessed with a sincerity that could border on the unnerving, with the idea that dolphins were not merely intelligent animals. They were minds, alien minds, running on sonar and salt water, speaking in clicks and frequencies that no human linguist had cracked. He began taking ketamine in his isolation tank, floating in skin temperature salt water, fully dissociated. He believed he was making contact, not just with dolphins, but with what he called EXO, the Earth Coincidence Control Office, a cosmic intelligence using coincidences to steer human evolution. Ketamine, he was convinced, was a kind of radio, a frequency, a way of tuning into signals the waking brain was too noisy to receive. Was he right? Almost certainly not in the way he believed. But what Lilly stumbled into, the idea that ketamine produced experiences so total, so cosmologically convincing, that they felt more real than ordinary reality, was something that thousands of people would rediscover independently, in very different settings, for very different reasons. The warehouse, 3 a.m. Those settings included, eventually, a fog machine-filled warehouse with a speaker stack shaking the floor and 1,000 people moving in various states of chemical transport. By the 1990s, ketamine had escaped the clinic entirely. It arrived in the rave scene as Special K, a disassociating agent that, at low doses, felt like being pleasantly wrapped in cotton, dancing not quite inside your body. The music helped. Techno and electronic dance music, with its repetitive pulses and textural layers, seemed almost engineered for ketamine consciousness. The way a beat could become an object you could walk around, inspect, fall into. At higher doses, ravers discovered what surgeons and prisoners and John Lilly had discovered before them. You could fall entirely out of the world. The K-hole was terrifying to some, transcendent to others. People lay on nightclub floors with their eyes open, technically conscious, traveling somewhere that had no geography. For a subculture already interested in altered states as a form of spiritual exploration, ketamine offered something more extreme, more interior, more annihilating than MDMA or LSD. A full ego death available in a bumped powder. It moved through rave culture across the UK, Europe, and America. It arrived in after-hours clubs. It became a fixture of festival grounds. And predictably, the abuse potential emerged. The bladder damage, the compulsive redosing, the psychological dependency that some users developed. Ketamine, like any powerful tool, was perfectly capable of being misused. The accidental antidepressant, but back in the labs, something remarkable was unfolding. Researchers studying schizophrenia had noticed that NMDA antagonists produced symptoms eerily similar to psychosis. This was interesting, but what happened next was something else entirely. As they dug deeper into ketamine's brain chemistry, they began testing it on patients with treatment-resistant depression, people who had failed antidepressant after antidepressant, some of whom had been depressed for decades. In 2006, researchers at the National Institutes of Health administered a single intravenous dose of ketamine to severely depressed patients. The results were so dramatic, they were almost hard to believe. Within hours, not weeks, not months, hours, patients reported the lifting of depression. People who had not felt pleasure in years suddenly felt it again. The black fog cleared with a speed that no antidepressant in history had ever achieved. The mechanism, as best anyone could explain it, was that BDNF-driven synaptic regrowth, the same fertilization cascade that makes ketamine's high neurologically unusual. Depression physically shrinks synaptic connections in the prefrontal cortex over time. Ketamine, in blocking NMDA receptors and triggering the compensatory glutamate surge, appeared to rapidly regenerate those connections. It was not just a chemical band-aid, it was structural repair. The FDA approved esketamine, a nasal spray version of ketamine's active mirror image molecule, in 2019 under the brand name Spravato. For the first time, a dissociative anesthetic that had lived on battlefields and warehouse floors had a formal legal place in psychiatric medicine. The clinics today, ketamine clinics, have quietly proliferated across the United States. They are not dramatic places. They tend to be softly lit, with reclining chairs, eye masks, and carefully chosen playlists. Usually ambient, instrumental, something designed to hold a dissolving mind gently. Patients come in for 4 infusions of ketamine over a series of sessions, typically supervised by an anesthesiologist or psychiatrist. Many patients who walk through those doors have tried everything else. Lithium, SSRIs, SNRIs, ECT.
I've tried everything to get over my depression.
They arrive depleted, often as a last resort. A significant portion of them walk out across a course of treatment.
Done.
We're going to try something different.
Reporting relief they hadn't experienced in years. The protocols vary.
I haven't felt this good in decades.
I'm so glad. We've had a lot of success with ketamine therapy.
Some clinics pair ketamine infusions with psychotherapy, working with patients during the window of neuroplasticity that follows a session, when the brain appears to be more receptive to new patterns. Others focus strictly on the pharmacology. Researchers are still sorting out what works best, for whom and for how long. And sitting somewhere in the back of every serious clinician's mind is the awareness that this drug has a history. That the same molecule renewing synaptic connections in a treatment-resistant depressive is the molecule John Lilly used to contact cosmic intelligence in a flotation tank. The same molecule soldiers tucked into their pockets in Vietnam. The same molecule those Michigan prisoners described as the feeling of dying while still alive. The strange arc. Calvin Stevens, the chemist who first synthesized ketamine in 1962, was looking for a safe way to put people under for surgery. He could not have imagined where his molecule would go. It has been a battlefield drug and a club drug, a research tool and a spiritual technology. It has been abused and it has healed. It has sent soldiers home and sent philosophers into the cosmos. A fungus was already making it before we were. What ketamine seems to insist on, in all its forms, is a question about the relationship between the brain's construction of reality and reality itself. The Michigan prisoners felt dead and came back. John Lilly felt like he spoke to something infinite. The veteran with PTSD woke from his infusion and cried, for the first time in years, with relief instead of terror. The raver on the warehouse floor stared at the ceiling and felt, for 20 minutes, that the universe was perfectly organized and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Same molecule, same receptor blockade, same dissolution of the ordinary. What you do with that dissolution, that turns out to be entirely up to you.